Picture yourself swinging a pickaxe in suffocating darkness, dust choking your lungs, your hands raw and bleeding, every swing a gamble with death. That was life for slaves in the silver mines of ancient Greece. For thousands, death wasn't a tragedy, it was freedom from a waking nightmare. Why was dying their only relief? What was it like to toil in those crushing tunnels? What secrets did those slaves bury in the earth? Stay with me, because this story will drag you into a world of pain, defiance, and lives lost to the shadows. Step back over 20 years to ancient Greece, where Athens sparkled with marble temples, philosophers' debates, and warships that ruled the seas. But that golden age hid a brutal truth: the silver mines of Laurion, south of the city, where slaves were sent to claw wealth from the earth. These weren't just mines, they were graves for the living, places where hope withered and bodies broke. The silver dug from Laurion fueled Athens' power, minting coins for trade, building ships for war, and raising temples to the gods. Yet behind every gleaming coin was a story of suffering, of men who paid with their lives. In this video, we're plunging into the heart of those tunnels. Who were the slaves sent to die there? How did they endure days that stretched like years? What scraps kept their hearts beating? What dangers shattered their bones and spirits? Why was death a mercy for so many? And what stories linger in those dark depths? By the end, you'll feel the weight of their chains, the sting of their pain, and the faint spark of their humanity. Let's start by meeting the people who vanished into the ground. Meet Nikos, a 16-year-old boy, his skin scarred, his eyes dulled by months in the dark. Nikos wasn't born a slave. He was a shepherd's son from a distant village in Thrace, where he once ran through green hills, chasing lambs under a sky so wide it seemed to hold all the stars. His hands knew the softness of wool, his ears the gentle bleating of his flock, his heart the warmth of his mother's laughter as she spun wool by the fire. Then war came. Soldiers burned his village, their torches turning his world to ash. Nikos tried to fight, swinging a stick at a warrior twice his size, but ropes bit his wrists as he was dragged to a market. There, under the shouts of traders, he was sold like livestock and marched to Laurion to mine silver for Athens. Most slaves were like him, captives from distant lands, men who owed debts they couldn't pay, or children born into chains. They weren't part of Athens' proud democracy, with its poets reciting in the agora or citizens voting under the sun. They were outsiders, Thracians, Scythians, or Greeks from fallen Citius treated as tools, their lives worth less than the silver they dug. Nikos woke each day with a hollow ache, the memory of his mother's lullabies fading like smoke. He could still see her face, her eyes crinkling as she sang him to sleep, her hands rough from weaving but gentle on his cheek. Now, the mines loomed ahead, their black mouths hungry for men. Who were these slaves, really? Were they just broken bodies, or did they cling to something stronger? Let's follow Nikos into their world to find out. Every morning, as the sky glowed faintly with dawn, Nikos shuffled toward the mine's entrance, his ankles shackled, the iron cutting his skin like a cold knife. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting straw, and the sharp tang of smoke from smoldering fires. The slaves lived in a sprawling camp near the mines, a chaotic sprawl of shacks patched together from splintered wood and crumbling mud, their roofs sagging under the weight of despair. The camp pulsed with misery-low groans of the sick, the clink of chains dragging through dirt, the harsh shouts of overseers snapping orders like whips. Nikos shared a shack with a dozen men, their bodies packed so tight he could feel their breath on his neck. He slept on the bare ground, a tattered cloth his only shield against the chill that seeped from the earth. Nights were restless, pierced by the coughs of men fighting sickness, or the soft murmurs of those whispering prayers to forgotten gods. Nikos lay awake, tracing the faint outline of stars through a crack in the roof, his mind drifting to the hills where he once herded sheep. He remembered racing his younger brother, Axios, through the grass, their laughter echoing as they tumbled into wildflowers. Axios would tease him, calling him slow goat, and Nikos would chase him until they collapsed, breathless under the sun. Now, in the camp, Nikos clutched a small, smooth stone he'd found near the mines, pretending it came from his village's stream. It was his only link to home, cool against his palm, a whisper of the life he'd lost. Some nights he heard a slave named Orin, an older man with a gray beard, hum a tune from his own land, the notes heavy with longing. Other nights, a boy no older than 12 wept softly, calling for his mother until exhaustion took him. Sleep was a cruel tease, offering no rest before the mines called Nikos back. What pushed him to rise each day in such a wretched place? It wasn't just fear, and we'll uncover that spark soon. Food was a thin thread holding life together. The mine owners doled out meager rations to keep the slaves working stale barley bread that scratched the throat, watery porridge that tasted like ash, and on rare days, a handful of shriveled olives or a strip of salted fish, so tough it hurt to chew. Water came in buckets, murky with silt, passed among dozens of filthy hands. Nikos sipped slowly, his lips cracked, savoring each drop as if it could wash away his hunger. Ancient records show slaves were fed less than soldiers or free laborers, their portions calculated to keep them just strong enough to swing a pickaxe. One morning, Nikos found a bruised fig in his ration, its faint sweetness a jolt of memory, his mother pressing fruit into his hands, her smile warm as the sun, her voice warning him to share with his sisters. He hid the fig from hungry eyes, knowing men had fought to the death over less. In the camp, Nikos saw a boy named Tycho steal a crust of bread, only to be beaten by another slave, their fists flying in a blur of desperation. Another time, a man named Samos traded his entire ration for a sip of wine from a guard, his eyes wild with need for a taste of something alive. Nikos once shared a scrap of fish with a young slave, a boy named Milo who reminded him of Axios, his small hands shaking as he ate. Milo's eyes lit up, a rare smile breaking through his dirt-streaked face, and Nikos felt a pang of warmth, like he'd given his brother a gift. Hunger was a constant claw in Nikos's gut, sharpening his senses but dulling his hope. Some days, he chewed on memories, picturing his mother's table, laden with warm bread, herbs, and goat cheese, the family gathered under a flickering lamp. Other times, he watched slaves hoard their rations, hiding crumbs in their rags, their eyes darting like hunted animals. Food was life, but it was never enough, and it wasn't the deadliest foe. Something far worse waited in the tunnel's depths. The work was a slow, grinding death. Nikos spent hours in tunnels so dark he could barely see his own hands. The air was heavy, thick with dust that stung his eyes and coated his throat, each breath a fight against choking. His job was to hack at rock walls, searching for silver veins that glimmered faintly under flickering torchlight. The tools were brutal iron pickaxes and chisels that tore his palms, leaving them bloody and raw. The mines were a twisting labyrinth, some shafts plunging hundreds of feet into the earth, others so narrow Nikos had to crawl, his shoulders scraping against jagged stone. Torches sputtered, their smoke burning his lungs, casting shadows that danced like ghosts, making the walls seem alive, ready to swallow him. The miners worked in teams, chipping away at rock, hauling debris in baskets woven from reeds. The baskets cut into their shoulders, leaving welts that never healed. Every swing of the pickaxe was a risk. A careless strike could spark flammable gases trapped in the rock, turning the tunnel into a fiery grave. Nikos heard whispers of such disasters whole crews burned alive, their screams echoing through the mines like a warning. Worse were the cave-ins. One day, a slave named Kiros, barely older than Nikos, struck a weak seam. The tunnel groaned, rocks crashing down, burying Kiros in seconds. His muffled cries haunted Nikos as the overseers shouted for the others to keep digging. Another time, Nikos's crew was hauling baskets when a shaft collapsed nearby, the air filling with dust so thick he couldn't breathe. He clawed his way out, his hands scraping rock, only to find two men trapped, their fingers twitching under the rubble. The overseers didn't stop to dig them out. Work was all that mattered. Nikos learned to listen for the earth's warnings of faint rumble, a shift in the air, but the mines were unpredictable, their dangers endless. Once, a slave named Praxis fell from a wooden ladder in a deep shaft, his body breaking on the rocks below. His scream lingered in Nikos's ears, a sound he couldn't shake. Death was a routine shadow, but what happened to those who survived the day only to face another kind of torment? Injuries were a daily curse, as common as the dust in the air. Nikos's hands were a patchwork of scars, his fingers numb from gripping tools hour after hour. His back throbbed from stooping in low tunnels. His knees bled from crawling over sharp rocks. Graves near Lorien tell a grim story: skeletons with cracked skulls, broken arms, and joints worn to nothing from years of strain. Some slaves had spines twisted like gnarled branches, warped by endless hours bent double. There were no doctors for slaves, no herbs or bandages to ease their pain. A cut could turn septic, a fever could kill in days. Nikos once saw a man named Aris, whose leg was crushed when a rock slipped from a pile. Aris clung to Nikos, his voice breaking as he spoke of a daughter waiting in a distant village, her laughter the only thing keeping him alive. The overseers dragged Aris away, his screams fading into the camp's noise. Nikos carried that sound in his heart, a weight heavier than any stone. Another time, he helped a slave named Myron, whose hand was mangled by a falling chisel. Myron begged Nikos to hide his injury, knowing he'd be cast out. Nikos wrapped the wound in rags, but Myron's fever came fast, and he was gone by week's end. Once, Nikos himself slipped, his ankle twisting under a loose rock. He limped for days, hiding the pain, knowing a useless slave was as good as dead. Another slave, a man named Leander, lost an eye to a splintered rock, his face swollen and bloody. He kept working, his good eye squinting in the dark, because stopping meant death. Injuries weren't the only killer, though. A silent enemy crept through the tunnels, waiting to strike. Disease was a relentless thief, stealing lives in the dark. The mines were damp and airless, dust settling into lungs like a slow poison. Flies swarmed the camp, landing on open sores and spreading sickness faster than a flame. Nikos woke one dawn to find his friend Dimas trembling, his face gray, a wet cough shaking his thin frame. By nightfall, Dimas was gone, his body wrapped in a rag and buried in a shallow pit outside the camp. Hundreds of graves line the hills around Lorien, filled with men whose bones show scars of lung disease, fevers, and starvation's cruel grip. Parasites from tainted water twisted their insides, leaving them too weak to lift their tools. Nikos saw men waste away, their cheeks hollow, their eyes like dark wells. One slave, an older man named Tiro, lasted months with a cough that rattled like stones. He told Nikos stories of his home by the sea, where he once fished with his sons, their nets glinting under the sun. Tiro's voice faded each day until he, too, was carried to the graves. Another slave, a boy named Elias, fell ill after drinking from a fouled bucket, his body shaking with fever. Nikos held his hand, whispering words of comfort, picturing his own brother in Elias' small frame. Elias slipped away, his breath stopping in the dark. A third slave, a woman named Siraon of the few women in the mines, forced to carry baskets, collapsed with a fever that burned her from within. She spoke of her village's olive groves, her words slurred until she went quiet. Nikos didn't know the names of these sicknesses, but he knew their terror. Every cough was a warning, every shiver a step toward the grave. Some slaves prayed to their gods, their whispered pleas echoing in the tunnels. Nikos joined them once, muttering a prayer to the wind spirits of his homeland, picturing the breeze over his village's hills, carrying his voice to his mother. He clung to that image, the only light in his darkness. Yet the work never paused, driven by the overseer's relentless will. How did they keep thousands of men moving through such a nightmare? Fear was a sharp tool, sharper than any whip. Overseers patrolled the tunnels, their sticks and lashes, quick to punish anyone who slowed. Nikos felt the sting across his shoulders, each blow a spark of pain that lingered for days. One overseer, a man with a scar across his cheek, seemed to take pleasure in it, his lash finding Nikos when he paused to wipe sweat from his eyes. Another, a gruff man named Dracon, would mock the slaves, calling them worms unfit for the sun. But fear wasn't the only chain. The mines were the heartbeat of Athens' power, producing silver for coins that bought temples, ships, and armies. The overseers told the slaves their work served a great city, a divine purpose to honor the gods, but those words rang hollow in the dark. Some slaves found ways to resist, small acts that kept their spirits from breaking. Nikos heard whispers of men hiding tiny flecks of silver in their rags, risking death for a spark of rebellion. One slave, named Kale, was caught and beaten until he couldn't stand, his defiance a warning to others. Others shared stories of their homes, their voices low to avoid the overseer's ears. Nikos met an old slave named Lycos, who carved a crude bird into a tunnel wall, a symbol of the freedom he'd lost. Nikos traced it with his finger, feeling a flicker of hope. Another time, he saw a slave named Eon slip a pebble into his mouth, a keepsake from his homeland, chewing it to remember the taste of freedom. Nikos began humming a shepherd's tune from his village, soft enough to stay secret, a thread of his old life woven into the gloom. One night, a slave named Cologne taught him a game scratching shapes into the dirt to guess each other's thoughts, a silent rebellion against the overseer's watchful eyes. Another slave, a quiet man named Thales, told Nikos about his sister, a weaver whose hands danced with thread. Thales spoke of her to keep her alive in his heart, his voice trembling as he described her smile. A slave named Phoebos, with a scar across his forehead, told Nikos about his father, a potter who shaped clay into bowls painted with stars. These stories were lifelines, tiny sparks in the endless dark. Nikos once found a broken reed in the camp and hid it, pretending it was a flute from his village, blowing silent notes to remember home. Defiance came at a cost, though, and the mines were quick to claim it. Death was a constant companion, its shadow never far. The Laurian mines ran for centuries, claiming thousands of lives. Cave-ins crushed men under tons of rock, their screams swallowed by the earth. Dust ruined lungs, turning strong men into shadows who coughed blood until they fell. Exhaustion took others, their hearts too weak to bear the endless toil. Nikos saw it happen too often. One day, a slave named Theron, built like a bull, dropped his pickaxe mid-swing. He clutched his chest, gasping, and collapsed. The overseer stepped over him, their boots kicking dust onto his still body, shouting for the others to keep working. Another time, a slave named Zeno fell during a long shift, his body too frail to rise. He lay in the tunnel, whispering his wife's name until he went quiet. Some slaves chose death over suffering. An old man named Pheres stopped eating his rations, his eyes calm as he let hunger take him, a final act of control. Another, a young slave named Damon, ran into a collapsing tunnel to save a friend, knowing he wouldn't make it out. His sacrifice was whispered about in the camp, a rare story of courage amid despair. A slave named Corax, who'd lost a brother in the mines, threw himself against an overseer, his fists flying until he was beaten down, his body left in the dirt. For many, death was a release, a door out of pain and chains. They spoke of it softly, their eyes distant, as if they could see freedom beyond the dark. Why was death such a mercy? The answer lay in the daily grind. In moments so cruel they shattered even the strongest. It was a day like any other, the tunnels heavy with heat and dust. Nikos's crew was deep underground, digging a new shaft, the air so thick it felt like breathing sand. The overseer's voice barked, demanding faster swings. Nikos gripped his pickaxe, his arms screaming, sweat stinging his eyes like needles. The torch flickered, its light barely cutting the dark. Then he heard Ita's low rumble, like the earth was growling. Dust fell, then small rocks, pelting his shoulders. "Run!" someone cried. But the tunnel was a trap, too narrow for escape. The ceiling buckled, stones crashing like thunder. Nikos threw himself flat, but a rock slammed into his shoulder, pain exploding through him like a wildfire. He gasped, dust choking his lungs, as screams faded into silence. When he opened his eyes, the tunnel was a grave. Half his crew was gone, buried under rubble, their tools scattered like broken bones. Blood soaked Nikos's tunic, His shoulder shattered, the pain so sharp he could barely breathe. He thought of his mother, her lullabies, the hills where he'd run free with Axios. He saw his village's stream, its water clear and cool, his sisters splashing in the shallows. He knew what happened to broken slaves. They were cast aside, left to die in the hills or beg in the streets. Lying there, the earth pressing down like a giant's hand, Nikos wondered if death would come now and if it might be kinder than the life he'd known. Nikos survived, but it was a hollow victory. His shoulder never healed, leaving his arm limp, his strength stolen. The overseers cut his chains, not out of kindness, but because he was useless to them. He limped away from Lorien, his body broken, his heart heavier than the rocks he'd dug. He left behind friends buried in unmarked graves, Dymas, Tiro, Ilias, and others their names erased by the wind. The silver from those mines built Athens' glorious Parthenon shining on the hill, its navy ruling the seas, its coins glittering in markets. But that glory was forged in blood. The slaves were people sons, who longed for their mothers, brothers who dreamed of open fields, dreamers who dared to hope in the dark. Their pain powered a city that forgot their names. Stand at Lorien today, and the hills are quiet, their scars hidden under grass and time. But listen closely, and you can hear their echoes, whispers of sacrifice, of strength, of lives that refuse to be fully silenced. If this story gripped your heart, you cannot miss our other video about the ancient world. It's a journey just as powerful and haunting. It's called What It Was Like to Build the Pyramids, and Why So Many Died Doing It. We dive into the lives of workers who hauled massive stones under the blazing desert sun. Their sacrifices as heavy as those in the mines, their stories just as heart-wrenching. If Nikos' pain moved you, the tale of those pyramid builders will leave you speechless. Click it now, because the secrets of the ancient world are waiting to pull you in, yet the mines hold more than pain. They hide secret tunnels sealed by time, silver stolen in acts of rebellion, stories of slaves who fought back against the dark. What else did those men leave behind in the shadows? That's a story for another video. Stay with me, because what's coming next will leave you stunned.